Hey everyone, we are live. Just going to give it a quick moment here, make sure you guys can hear us. We did upgrade from our last stream to get some new mics, so hopefully the audio quality is much better. But yeah, just let us know in the chat if you can hear us. Let's give it another minute here.
Sounds like people are saying hello. Hopefully you guys can all hear us on the chat. There's a slight delay, so it's hard to just know that everything's coming through loud and clear.
Cool. Yeah, so we'll get started then, and hopefully it's all good. My name's Josh. I'm the camera in the bottom right. I'm the community manager here at Figma, and I'm located in Long Beach, California, so just south of LA. Remote employee. I've been at Figma for about a year now. I have a background in design as well. So in the past, I was a product designer at a small design agency called Masio, did freelance design for about a year, and then joined Figma to manage their online community. So if you've interacted with us on Spectrum or Twitter, you've most likely have come in contact with me. So I'm excited to be here. Today, our session is on Figma 101. So we're just going to go over the basics of Figma, talk about vector networks and components and prototyping, and kind of go through a sample app. If you're brand new to Figma, if you don't have an account, you can sign up for free right here. So you can sign up. Oh, of course, my trackpad decides to die right now. One second. So yeah, you can sign up, create a free account, and then you'll get launched straight into Figma. So I'm going to show you that now. Let me swap to my different screen. Yeah, so once you sign up, this is kind of the screen that you'll be jumped into. So this is the file browser. On the left side here, you have recents, you have drafts, and deleted files. Recents obviously shows you all of your recent files, so you can see this plants app, which we'll jump into. Tom and I have been editing that, so that shows up first. We've got our multiplayer live assets, the things that you see on the screen. You will start out with, I believe, this sample file and maybe some other ones. But on this left side here, we have the team. So we created a Figma multiplayer live team. Within that, you have projects. To get them to show up in this panel, you just unstar or star them here. You can create new projects. So maybe we wanted to create one for our design system. It creates a new one, and then you can start creating files in there. So I'm going to jump into our plants app for this Figma 101. This is what we're going to be creating here. You can see we have kind of this intro screen with the logo. This will transition into this welcome screen. We've got a feed here of different houseplant photos and comments and likes. We've got a detailed view, so when you click on this post, you'll see this. And we've got a search view. Let me show you the prototype now, just to kind of show you where this is at. So this is what we're going to be building. You can see we have a scroll view here. You can kind of scroll through it. You can click on one of these plant images to get to the detailed view. You have back to feed. Click on another one, and you'll see this kind of updates in real time. So it's all connected to the editor, and we're going to walk through that. So within here, within Figma, you've got your toolbar up at the top. This is where you'll find your editing tools. If you're coming from Sketch, this should feel pretty similar. You've got a move and scale tool. You've got your frames. Tom will go over that in a little bit. We have our shape tool, so you have rectangle, line, polygons, things like that. Our pen tool, so we have a unique kind of feature at Figma called vector networks, which I'll kind of demonstrate in making this leaf icon here in a little bit. You've got your text tool, and then you have comments. Because Figma is based In the browser, everything's real time. You can see Tom's cursor is kind of floating around. It's a collaborative tool, so you can comment, you can work with multiple people at the same time, you can have viewers, editors, so on and so forth. And then on this left side, you have pages, so you can kind of swap through there, you can create new ones. You have your layers panel, and then you have your components panel. So this will show both local components, and then we have this thing called team library, which is actually all the way over here in the top right corner. And this is where you can share components with your team. So if I were to turn on, these colors or components, you'll see it updates in real time. So this was actually from a previous session there. I'm going to turn those off. In the middle, obviously, you have your canvas. So this is kind of the main place where you're going to be working. It's more or less unlimited. The browser does cause some limitations, but you can zoom in, zoom out. When you create a new Figma file, you don't have to set the canvas size or anything like that. And then over on the right, we have our properties panel. So this adapts to whatever you have selected. So right now I just have the canvas selected. So you'll see you have a background property. So I can actually change the background color of the canvas. It shows your local styles. You can export things from here. You can turn on pixel preview, things like that. If you notice, if I select this intro card here or frame, you'll see that this property panel now changes. So you have kind of some alignment settings up at the top. You have your frame settings. So right now it's set at an iPhone 8. We have a bunch of pre-built kind of templates for different things that you might build on a regular basis. So desktop, different print sizes, Twitter, Instagram posts, things like that. You have layout grids, your layer properties, background layer. So, I can change the background of that. Fill settings, stroke settings, so on and so forth. That's the properties panel. Up at the top, you kind of have 3 different views. So you have design, prototyping, and code. And these 3 views you kind of swap between. So obviously with prototype, if I select one of these, you'll see all these noodles appear, and this just kind of shows all the different connections, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then code actually shows different properties that you can give to your developers, so they can jump in here even with a free account with just view access and actually have access to seeing this. So I can click on this icon, I can see that it has a width of 90 pixels, it has a height of 114, it's positioned, XY positions, and its name. And then if that was set to export, I'd also be able to export that as well. So that's the properties panel. You'll notice a few other things. So you can see Tom's name here. If I click on his name, I'm now actually observing him. So as he moves around and zooms in and out, I can actually see what he's doing. Yep, there you go. Zooms in, he's moving around. So I'm observing Tom right now. So you can imagine as you have multiple people in, you may want to jump and see what they're working on. And we'll kind of show this off a little bit more. You then have your share settings. So obviously Tom is already invited to this, but let's say you are starting fresh and you wanted to invite a colleague or a friend into your design file. This is the screen that you would do this in. You can either copy a link and make it available to everyone, or you can invite them by typing in their email address, or if they're already a part of your team and you want them in this project, you can start typing out their name. That's the share settings. You have a few other settings up here to present. So when we went into the prototyping view, that's how you get access to that. Some view settings, pixel preview, pixel grid, things like that. And that's about it. So I know that was a quick overview. I wanted to move quick so we can get into the actual creation of everything. But yeah, so I'm going to pass it off to Tom. We're going to watch his screen here for a little bit, and we're going to start creating stuff.
Cool. Am I sharing now, Josh?
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name's Tom. I'm a designer advocate at Figma. Josh and I have been working together for a little bit of time since I started, which was around August. My background is also in design, and I won't spend too much more time on the introduction, but I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to create something that like kind of looks like this app as best we can, and then just like demo some of the features in real time. So I'm going to start with a blank document. So if I go back out to our file browser here, we've got a Figma 101 project for the stream today, and I'm going to create a new file. So if I click the new file button, that's going to launch just a blank canvas that we can work with. So if you're using Figma for the first time, all of your designs take place in what we call a frame. If you're coming from other design tools, we usually refer to that as an artboard, but they're called frames in Figma. When you select the frame tool here, you'll get a list of presets, which Josh showed you earlier. So today we're just going to pick an iPhone 8. And when I click that, it's automatically going to put an iPhone 8 sized frame for us to start working within. And so once we create the first frame, you'll also notice that you get an entry here in the layers panel. And so once if I take the rectangle tool and draw a box within that frame, now you can see that that layer is nested within this frame. And if we want to move the position of this somewhere around in our artboard, everything that's inside it comes with it. One of the things that you'll want to first sort of like learn about in terms of like a slightly more advanced feature than like just drawing things like boxes with the basic tools, which work like if you're coming from other design tools, they work really similar. You just select them and click and drag. So this is our ellipse tool, rectangle tool, triangle tool, which will make an equilateral triangle. And when you click on the ellipse tool, in particular, you get this little handle when you hover over it, which is what we call the arc tool. So when you highlight over that, you can actually like segment a circle. So if you wanted to make like a spinner or a pie chart, you could do that too. You can grab the center one if you wanted to make like a donut chart, which is pretty useful in a lot of scenarios. But those are sort of like the basic shape tools. I think Josh is going to touch a little bit more on the pen tool and draw some vector networks, but I'm going to start out with just sort of like a basic intro to components. So if you're new to Figma, components are like these reusable objects that you can use across all your designs. There's a couple of different workflows, which we'll talk about as we go through the demo of using components. But basically, it is a reusable object. So for example, if I was to create something like start creating, this top header bar that we have here in the demo. So maybe I'm just going to start things off really rough. And let's just say we've got something like a hamburger menu. I'm going to just draw some like rectangles that are going to be about 3 pixels high. Over here, I'm going to change the quarter radius so that they have like a rounded corner. And holding Alt and dragging, I can make it a duplicate of this one. And if I hit Command D or Control D on Windows, you'll see that now makes a duplicate of that one with the same spacing. And let's just say I make that white. I'm going to put this here. And so now we know that something like this is going to get repeated across all of our screens. And one of the things that is sort of like unique to everyone's individual workflows is sort of like, when do you start creating components or reusable objects? A lot of people sort of like think about going back and doing that later. Because they're not sure what these things are going to look like. And my philosophy is always like, you kind of have an indication early on in a project when something is going to get repeated across a lot of screens. So I'm always have the mindset of like to create components a little sooner in the process. So for example, with all of these items selected, I'm going to go up here to the create component button. You can also hit Command Option K to do it. And so now I've got a new component and I've got this icon that shows up in my layers panel, which looks like 4 diamonds. And so that indicates that it's a master component. And what that means is if I hold Alt and make a copy of this component, I now have what we call an instance of that component. What that means is this is just like a replica of this one, and any edits that I make to this one are going to propagate to these other ones. So as we start making additional screens, when we start refining what the design of this header is going to look like, we don't have to keep going back and updating that on all the screens. We can just do it in one place. So I'm going to just start laying the foundations, just highlighting a couple features for our design here. So I've got this header bar. Presumably, we probably want some sort of grid. So within each frame, you have the ability to create what we call a layout grid. So this isn't like an overall grid setting. Like if you're coming from Sketch, you can enable these grids for each artboard. They get added to your frames as sort of like a property. So if I go over here and click the plus sign, you'll see that it's now added like a default 8-pixel grid to my frame. But I'm going to go here and switch it to columns. And then for the simplicity of this one, I'm going to go to a single column, and I'm going to add some 16-pixel margins. So now you can see where this one margin is, and we're going to sort of like have our design sort of like adhere to that. So maybe within my component, I want to go align this to this side and align this menu here. And then maybe the background is going to be black. So you can see that it changes in both places. And in that case, we'll maybe make this text a bit bigger and make it white. We'll come back and we'll adjust some of these design details a bit later. The next thing that we need to work on, and I'm going to use a component to do this too, and then I think Josh is going to jump in and help me out, is I'm going to create like a component for the post that's going to repeat. So I'm switching to the rectangle tool. I'm going to draw just a square that sort of like fits in with that grid. And then I'm just going to start really roughly, again, placing some things within this thing. So I'm going to put a placeholder here for the username. Josh, feel free to jump in anytime. And then I'm going to create just a placeholder here for the image. Now, one thing that you can do in Figma, just to highlight a quick feature here, is if you go into your preferences and go down here to nudge amount, you'll see that by default, usually you get 1 in 10. But if you're using something like an 8-pixel grid, you can change your big nudge to 8. And what that means is basically if you have when you hold shift and use your arrow keys, it'll increase the pixel value, either the positioning or the size of elements, depending what you have selected, by this amount. So I really like setting mine to 8. So like if I hold shift and control and press the left button, you can see that it incremented the size of that by 8. And if I do it again, I now have like a nice 16-pixel margin. And then maybe down here below, I'm going to have something that just says username, or let's just say photo description.
Cool. So while you work on that, Tom, I'm going to swap to my screen and just kind of show off some vector networks and kind of also with using components here, but let me jump to that real quick. Okay. So I've created here just another frame here. It's just size 120, 120. So it's just a custom one, not using one of those presets. And I'm actually also going to use a layout grid here just to help me create kind of a pixel perfect icon here for our leaf logo. So I'm going to change this grid from 8 pixels to actually 1 pixel. Kind of seems a little intense here, but you'll see why. So I'm going to go up here and select the pen tool. You can also just tap P. Now, what's unique to Figma is this idea of vector network. So actually, before I jump into the leaf, traditionally when with the pen tool, maybe from Illustrator or Sketch or other tools, it's kind of one directional. So, if you were to create something like an arrow, this point, then has to connect somewhere else. So, I could create one end of that arrow, but how do you get to the next point? So if you actually hit the escape key and then move, you can select this point again and then line that up. So now we've got this nice kind of arrow here. We can do the same with, if I create a box, I can then, select this and create a diagonal cross here. So that's, oops, undo that, connect that. So that's the pen tool. You've got some settings up here in the top left. So you have the bend tool, which you can activate by holding down Command. So if you wanted to create a curve here, I just hold down Command, click that, and now I've got a curve here, and you can extend the handles. Over in the properties panel, you have some options as well. So mirror angle or no mirroring. So mirror angle means that the angle will stay the same, but I can make this one a different length. And then no mirroring means that they're two separate. So if you wanted to kind of create a cool sort of wave, you can do that. You also have the paint bucket tool. So this is great. So I can kind of create fills here. So you can create some pretty complex shapes easily. And it's all one. You'll actually notice that in my layers panel, this is a single vector layer here. So yeah, so I'm going to create this leaf here. I'm just going to delete all of this. So to create this leaf, I've got this grid. We're going to use the pen tool. We're just going to find the middle here. I'm just guesstimating. We're going to draw a straight line down. And then we're going to maybe angle here. And if you actually click and hold as you create it, you can kind of auto create the bend tool. So now you have a curve. So I'm just going to curve that and then bring it back up here. So not the best right now, but we'll kind of edit this, bring this down a bit, bring this over, bring that. Okay. So, so this is like one half of the leaf. The cool thing is if I actually create this and create this into a component, so now you see, and we'll just call this leaf half. We're gonna duplicate this, and then I'm gonna flip it just by doing Shift H, which converts it or flips it on the horizontal axis. And then I'm going to line it up here. So you can see here, it's not quite aligned. We're going to make sure it's aligned on the pixel grid. So it's not the best right now, but as we go through here, to get the idea, I'm going to continue working on this, pass it back to Tom here in just a second. But if I click enter on this shape and go back to the pen tool, and if I draw these kind of like angles, you'll see that it's automatically represented in this instance here. So the cool thing about that is this allows you to kind of create these symmetrical shapes. You know, as I change this angle here, kind of adjust this leaf to make it a little nicer looking here. It adjusts across the board. So I'm going to continue working on this, pass it back to Tom to kind of continue going through components in the example.
Cool, thanks Josh. So while Josh was doing that, I kind of refined the design of this component. So now we have card, which you can see if I flip over, it's starting to look a little bit more similar to this. Maybe up here, whoops. In our master component, I've just moved outside of our artboard here. And I've actually given this frame a gray background, but it's a little close to the canvas. So when you have situations like that, you can just sort of like adjust the background of your canvas. That way you can sort of like see where your frames are. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add one more thing here. And I'm going to right align that in the box, and I'm just going to change the color to something a little lighter and the size down a little smaller and anchor that. So now at this point, we've got this reusable design. It's probably going to have to scale between different viewport sizes as you start thinking about like different devices. So if I make a copy of this just out here, when I scale this, you can see that this is probably not what you want this design to look like when you scale it. So that's where we can set resizing constraints. So if we come back here to our master component, you'll see if I click on this profile area, it's set to scale. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now set that to my top left because I always want it to be in the top left. And I also want this username to be top left as well. This one is going to be a bit different. I want this to be anchored to the top right. So over here, I'm going to set this to right and then top. And then when I select my placeholder where my image is going to go, I can set that to left and right and also anchor it to the top. And then what I've got is I've got, these other little bits of text here. I'm going to anchor those to the left and the right so that it scales. Actually, this one I'm going to set to scale because it's sharing this line with this one. And this one I'm going to set to right. So what you'll now see is when I take one of these things and I resize it, it resizes almost a little bit more predictability. We have a couple more to set. So if we go back in here, watching this one over here, this one is going to be set to top. And so as soon as I set that to top, and I actually am going to set this one to left and right. And you'll see now this is sort of like scaling a little bit more like you'd imagine it. And I just have to update one more here to the top. And so now we have a card that's going to scale just like we wanted. And with this one here, it's a single line. So one of the things I may want to do is like anchor it to the bottom. So as I scale the component, the text box goes with it. You'll see it just stays on one line in here. So if I set this to top and bottom, you'll see now that this text box, if it's set to a fixed width, it should scale. So now you can see it's got bigger with the component. And so now we have a flexible component that we can use. Now, the cool thing is, if you think back to what I did earlier, is I added this layout grid. It's a single column, but it maintains 16 pixel margins from the edge of the screen. So one of the cool things that I can do is I can actually select all of these, and I can actually apply constraints to this component that are relative to the top level artboard. So if I go and anchor this to the left and the right, what that's going to do is that's actually going to anchor those components to the actual layout grid, so it maintains that 16 pixel padding. Now in this case, this top component, I have not set the constraints on yet, so we could go back and we could do that as well. And I think Josh is going to add the logo into this component in a few minutes. But let's just go and update these constraints. And I'll do that to the overall frame. And so now things are starting to take shape a little bit. So now you have this design. Here's what it would look like on an iPhone 8 size, but let's just say we change this to like iPhone SE. You'll see that like everything is like scaling with the viewport. So that makes things a little bit easier to manage. Now, the other thing is you're like quickly iterating through your designs. You may want to change the spacing between objects. And what we do in Figma, I'm actually just going to throw something off here. I'm just going to like increase this size to be, or this distance from this bottom part. If I make a selection, there's probably a good chance that I want to like equalize all of the spacing in between these items, but I also may want to play around with different spacing. So we have a feature called Smart Selections. So right away, because these don't share the same space, we show this little icon here, which is our tidy up icon. And if I click that, it just made the space between all of them the same. And you'll see this little input field appeared here as well. And if we zoom in, you'll also see that there's these little magenta handles. And if I zoom out, what that does is if I grab those handles, it allows me to, across all of those items, change the spacing. And if you think back to what I had said earlier about the nudge settings, if you're using something like an 8-pixel grid, if you hold shift, those smart selections are going to follow your 8-pixel nudge. So right now, it's going from like 8, 16 to 24. So that's a quick little feature that will save you a ton of time. Now, the next thing is I want to put images in all of these boxes. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add some, we're building this plant app, so we want to add some of these plant images. One of the cool things that you can do in Figma is you can go up to this place image feature. And if you do that, it'll allow you to browse. Excuse me. And so if I select a bunch of these pictures, you'll see I get a little cursor that shows that I've got 6 images, and it gives me a little preview. And what I can now do is just start clicking on these boxes, and these images get dumped in as a fill. So now I've really quickly populated all of these component instances. And so if we click on one of these rectangles that I've set up as a placeholder, you can see that it's added a fill property. And that's sort of like one of the many ways of overriding things within a component. So you can see like now this component is starting to look different than this component. And what's cool about that is that I can start overriding. So this is my really creative description. I could override the username, and I'm doing this all in line. You'll notice if you came from other tools, sometimes you have to make these edits in an overrides panel. We find it really intuitive. You can just like click on the thing that you want to change. You know, we can start giving people usernames. We can also use the same feature to start putting people's faces on these things. So I've got some UI faces here. So let's put those in. And you get the idea. And so again, updating this component, if we were to start picking colors, so maybe one of the things I want to do is find a nice green color that we're going to use as like our corporate color here. So maybe it looks something like this. And we probably want to use this color in a couple of different places. So that's like a good segue into styles. So if I was to click on this little 4-dot icon, which is our styles icon, it brings up a styles palette. So this is like a default palette that we have on our team. But if we were to create a style, I can create a new one that's local. So let's just call this. So now you can see that it appears in our local styles, and we can update that in a whole bunch of different places. So like maybe this leaf that Josh added to our header, maybe we want to apply that color to it. We can do that. And what's great about starting to apply the color styles is now we can sort of like centrally manage them. Like, you know, partway through, much like components, you want to start assigning styles to things as you start seeing patterns where you're using the same colors, because basically, if we decide, you know what, I'm not sure about that green, you know, maybe we want to change it to this neon green, we can make that edit and it updates everywhere where that style is used. So I'm going to go back because I like the color that we just chose. But yeah, the other thing we can do is we can also add effects. So if I click on this background shape that I'm using, I can add a drop shadow. So I had one already added, but I could toggle it, and you'll see that that gets added. When you click on this little icon here, you can sort of change some of the properties of the drop shadow, like the offset and its opacity. So maybe we'll make that a little softer. And now you can see things are starting to take shape. The next thing we can start doing is thinking about building out some additional pages in this. The last thing I'm going to touch on before Josh starts building out the detail pages is Josh had mentioned in the quick overview at the beginning this idea of libraries. So as you start working in teams, there's probably going to be resources that you want to bring into individual projects for reuse. So, you know, if we were building other flows or something for that, we may want to share these components, but we also may want to bring in common things that we use, like let's just say iOS assets. So if we go up to our team library modal up here, this will show me all of the shared libraries that I have. And a shared library is basically any document that you've published components from. So if you look, I've got these components. Some of the ones that Josh created, I created some icons while Josh was creating the leaf. And if we wanted to share these components, it's just a matter of going back into this document and hitting publish. And now, in our case, untitled is going to be a library that we can turn on for other files. But I'm going to search for our iOS UI kit. And if I turn that on, it's going to populate my component sidebar here, which you can always access by down at the bottom of the layers panel. And you can also search it. So for instance, on this design, we probably want to add something like a status bar. So, you know, I can grab in, you know, the status bar and like actually just drop it into my designs, or in our case, we probably want this one here. And so now I've just quickly added a status bar, and I can set the constraints to be left and right. And now I have a status bar that's ready to go in the design. And as we start duplicating these screens, we now have another component that we're pulling in from our shared library for reuse. But I'll pass it over to Josh to build out the next screen, and then we'll start to move on to prototyping.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Yeah. So I saw a question in the chat actually around version control. Well, we don't have like a standard, you know, version control in terms of Git. We do have what's called version history. So I'm just going to show that real quick and then jump into the components. So if you click on the title of the page, right now ours is called Untitled, you'll see this little drop down. Also, I have to apologize. I'm sorry, I don't know why my cursor isn't showing up, but it's not. So hopefully you can follow along. You'll see the show version history though. If you click on that, all of a sudden the properties panel kind of changes over here and you'll start seeing different versions. So we can go back to 1239 and you'll see that artboard that, or sorry, the frame that Tom duplicated is no longer there. You can name this version, restore this version, or duplicate from it. So it's just a great way to kind of keep track of your projects. You can also manually create versions. So here I'm gonna cancel version history. And if I go up here to file, you'll see save to version history. So it's option command S. So if I click on that, it says add to version history. So maybe we can say first draft or something like that. You know, added plant card. And I save that. And then if I go back to version history, you'll see it says first draft, added plant card, Tom Lowry and Josh. And we can go back to that. So that is a way that you can kind of manage it. This is something that we do want to improve at Figma, and it's something that we're working on to make it easier for teams to you know, keep track of different versions, share versions to clients, things like that. So, but yeah, anyways, let me go back. So actually Tom started kind of modeling this out here. He's got some comments here. I'm gonna actually take over and just let's add in some like additional pictures. So if you saw from that example, we had some different ones. So I'm gonna go here. Actually, I'm gonna check real quick. Was it below or above? It's above. Cool. We're gonna drop these comments down a bit. And I'm just going to create a grid of photos here. So we'll do maybe like 70 pixels. So if you see, let me go back actually. So if I select this and then hold down Option and then drag over, it's going to duplicate this, and I've placed it 4 pixels apart. And then if you hold Command and press D, so Command D, it'll actually continue to do that. So now what I want to do is actually have these nested inside this frame. And so right now you can see they're outside of this major component. So actually, Tom, question for you. Should I add these to the main component? It's going to mess that up, right?
No, you can do that over top, and then when we go to prototyping, we'll show how to make like a scrolling carousel frame.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we've got these different images. We'll just kind of, I'm actually just going to copy, for the sake of this, styles. So you have this shape here with an image already on it. So you can actually go over to this fill setting in the properties panel and highlight it so it's selected as blue. And then if you hold, or if you do Command C, and now if I select these other shapes here, you'll actually see, and then Command V, it copies that style over. So if for some reason, you know, this plant actually had like, you know, a gradient on top of it, we'll show like, you know, some gradient. It had a blend mode of, you know, maybe like overlay or something like that. You could also choose to copy that style over as well. So you'll see now it just adds that style, fill style on top of it. So anyways, I'm gonna get rid of those. So now we have these plants here. So another way I probably should have done this is actually created this as a component itself, and then we can just say, you know, small image, and then if I delete these, the reason I did that is, let's say I wanted to change the styling here. So let's say I wanted them to have rounded edges. So if I add that, it's going to update them across the board and you don't have to go back. Plus, as we start duplicating this out, you'll want to make sure you keep those connected. So yeah, we've got some images there. I guess I'll actually swap them out with a couple other just to make it a little different.
And while you do that, if you want, I can talk through the nav bar that I'm building now as well.
Yeah, of course. I'll
If
pass
you
it
want
back to you.
Cool. So as Josh was doing that, I started building out a nav bar that we're going to use at the bottom with three. This is just a frame. It's got a black rectangle in it, which I used when I initially created it, but we could actually delete that rectangle in the background and then just give it a background color as part of the frame. You'll also notice if I hit Control G, it like toggles the layout grid. So I've added a layout grid on top of this. And just like before, one of the things that I can do is I can set these, I'm going to set these icons to be centered. So center, and then I'm going to set these ones to be left and right. Whoops, top, sorry, and left and right. And so now that we have that, if I toggle the grid, you'll see that these icons stay centered within that grid. And then for our active tab, we're just going to make these things use our green color. And so now we have this thing that I'm going to turn into a component now. So now we've got a component. We're just going to call this navbar, and we can put that at the bottom. So when we put this at the bottom of the design, you'll see I need to make it a little bit wider, but the layout grids make that easy to happen. I can set some constraints again. This is always going to be anchored to the bottom of the screen. So if we decide to add more content and just scale this down, that nav bar is going to stay anchored to the bottom. And one of the cool things that we can start doing on these elements as we start thinking about the prototype is we can also make them fixed so that they're sticky. So right now, if we go to this checkbox here, fix position when scrolling, it's going to turn that into a sticky element. And you'll see that it now divides my layers into two categories. So everything below the scroll subhead are going to be things that scroll, and everything that is above are going to be things that are sticky. So we probably want things like this header maybe to be fixed, and then we may want this status bar to also be fixed. I think we made that as part of the component, so that's all good. And the next thing as we start thinking about the prototyping view is things like, how do we want to link things together? And then how do we want things to behave? So just to pick up where we left off before, Josh created this frame, which we are going to turn into a carousel. So you'll see if you hit Command Y, a really interesting, useful feature is outline mode. So if you have objects that expand outside of a frame that are like cropped, you can hit Command Y and you can see the outline extends beyond this boundary. And then what I can do is if we flip over to our prototyping tab now, we can set the overflow behavior to horizontal scrolling. Now, depending on your use case, you may set this to a different setting, but in our case, we want to just be able to like thumb left to right with this. So I'm going to set that. And now we're going to start linking some of the screens together. So Josh is building a go back to home button. And just for after Josh finishes that, he's going to duplicate all of these screens and we'll start linking them. So in this particular case, when you touch on this tile, maybe we want it to go to the screen. So I'm going to just, in the prototyping mode, you'll see anything you click on shows this node. And with that node, you can just click and drag to a frame that you want to link to. Once you've made that connection, you'll now have that interaction selected, and you'll be able to set all of the parameters of that interaction. So there's a couple of different triggers. So I'm just going to have it set up to on tap. It's going to take us to the iPhone 8 screen, which they're both named iPhone 8 screen, which is probably a good cue to rename these. You can just hit Command R. So I'm going to call this recent feed, and then I'm going to call this photo detail. So now you'll see when we click back on this little link, it's going to the photo detail page. And then we can set the transition properties. So maybe I want this to slide in, and you'll see it's going to show what that looks like. You could also change it to a push. So let's just say we use that one. And then if we go back to Josh's back home, there's a couple of different ways we could do this. We could link this back just like that. Or we could also say on tap, we could go back, and that'll return us back to the previous screen. So you see this little interaction here. And then we can start linking all of these things up. So I think as Josh creates these and changes the pictures, we can go through and link them up, but you sort of get the idea of like how that's going to work. It's just a matter of doing that. We can also create things like overlays. So I don't really have a good example here of like something that you actually might use an overlay, but let's just say we're going to show somebody a confirmation dialogue when you like one of these things. So what we can do is we can just draw a frame outside of our artboards. Maybe this is how big we want the dialogue to be. And we can say something like, are you sure you want to like this photo? And so we can add a little accent in there like this. I won't go into like, you know, all the interactions to make this perfect, but let's just say when you do click on this thing, you want this to, or, you know, maybe it's this one. We can go back to the prototype, and what we can do is we can say on tap, and we can link it just to this outside frame. And you'll see by default, it creates a navigation connection. One of the things that we can do is actually set this up as an overlay. So now what happens is we can change the position of the overlay. So if we want this to be centered over top of the image, and if you want it to have like a background behind it, we can also configure that. And if it's like a dismissible modal, then you can also click outside of it. I'm going to push it over to Josh, and then Josh can talk a little bit more about the prototype links that he's creating.
Yeah, so you'll notice that if I go to prototyping mode here, I've started to connect this. The nice thing is, you know, Tom set that first back component, or sorry, the back connection, and you'll see that as I duplicated this frame out, it keeps those connections across. So the way that we like to think about prototyping is if you think of all of the components to begin with and connect it, and then start duplicating your screens after the fact, it will keep a lot of those connections and make it a lot easier for you. So I'm going to take this tab bar, actually copy that and place that on these. We're going to line those to the bottom. Actually, Tom, do you mind putting the tab bar on all of those?
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
And then, so yeah, so we have those connections there. We've got the, let me go back to prototyping mode. Got the go back mode. You'll see Tom created that heart, obviously, with the overlay. So you'll get that. Some of the other settings that you get, so obviously this is an iPhone 8, so you can actually change that. If you have constraints, you can kind of test that out in real time. We have different models, gold, silver, space gray, and then you can change the background. So if you're using this for user testing or just to show stakeholders, it's a great way just to make this look nice, I guess. So let's go kind of like mint green color. We'll do gold. The starting frame, you can also change that there. And then we're just going to click play here. And you'll see that it presents it in this phone. The scrolling set up as we scroll through. There is an option, so a lot of people ask about this. So if I were to kind of just click around, it kind of shows where you can click. You can turn those off by just unchecking show hotspots. So if you want it to feel a little bit more realistic, you can turn those off. But we've got this, so now if I click on this photo, you see it kind of pushes to the left and this comes in. And then we've got this horizontal scroll. So because the prototype's directly connected to the canvas, or to the editor, so if we need to make a change, especially as we're collaborating, so Tom, right now on the detail page, can you create it so it scrolls? Because right now the tab bar is cutting off some of the comments. So Tom's going to make that change, and you'll actually watch as it will update in real time here. So now you can see that this now scrolls. So We have both horizontal and vertical scrolling all in one frame. So you can actually stack a bunch of different scrolls, or the overflow behaviors. You can create like map views, things like that. And you're seeing as Tom is adjusting this, I guess I'm saying, OMG, I need this plant. So then we have go back home. If I click on this other one, you'll see it changes the picture there. Obviously, you know, we didn't create this as a component where it shows everything, so it's a lot of repeat right now just for the sake of the demo, but you get the idea. So yeah, that's the prototype mode. We also do have a mirror app that you can download in the app stores, and that lets you select, if we go back to the editor, select the frame, and then actually view that connected to Wi-Fi or I believe Bluetooth, and you can view that. So that's prototyping. Oh, I forgot to show the heart. So
Did you leave a comment yet, Josh?
I've not left any comments. Yeah, that's a good
Cool.
point. So if I, so let's say I click on this overlay. If I click the C shortcut to bring up comments, you can also find it up here in the top left. Let's say I'm going to leave it at Tom. Can we change the copy on this? So you can imagine a stakeholder is viewing this prototype, and they can comment on it. And if we actually go back to the canvas now, or actually I'm going to switch to Tom's screen real quick, and he'll show his view. So he actually sees that comment now because he's in the editor associated with that frame. And he doesn't have to go to the prototyping mode. So because they're interconnected, he gets to see that in real time kind of in the editor and not have to go back to the prototyping mode to do that. He can comment back on it. I can, now that I'm in the editor, I can view that comment here. I could resolve that comment. Or if I'm back in the prototype, I can also see that there. See, it shows no problem. Thanks. And then we'll resolve this. So that's commenting. They are connected to frames. It's a great way to just kind of communicate different ideas or ask for changes or things like that. So commenting is also something that we want to expand on in the future. So be on the lookout for that. We're running out of time here. It's almost 1 o'clock. So wanted to open it up for a few questions. But before I do, Tom, did you have anything else?
Yeah, I was just going to start answering a couple of the questions and then demo a couple things that are relative to the comments.
Cool.
So can version histories be viewed by non-editors? Currently, no, but it's like some of the things around the version history are things that we're continuing to explore as we sort of learn more about how people want to work with version history. So if you have specific ideas, one thing that we should highlight, hopefully Josh is set the stream to go to my computer now. I know sometimes in these live streams and stuff, we also get a lot of feature requests and things like that. I just wanted to highlight this one thing down here. There's a little help bubble. When you click here, you can access like our community forum on Spectrum, video tutorials that we have on YouTube. But if you click on Get Help, you'll be able to see common questions, but you'll also be able to ask a question. So if you ever do encounter a bug, you can click on this button and you can file a bug report or a feature request. That way we can track them. I know sometimes these things are happening like in video chats and stuff, and it's like really hard to like consolidate them. So if you have a really good idea of something that would help your workflow, please tell us. And there was another question there about layout grids and margins. And I think another question about like a button with an icon and the same thing. That's something that we definitely want to enable in Figma. Having actual padding that like adjusts as text expands is something that we don't have yet, but we'd really like to see that in Figma as well. The example that you might be talking about was kind of a couple of creative ways to use layout grids, which I'll demo right now. So if we look at this component, I'm going to add a layout grid. If I add a column grid, maybe I want to sort of like visualize what the margins are. If you remember, I made the margins on this about 16 pixels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the gutter to 0, and I'm going to set the margin to 16. And I'm just going to increase this value. So now you see I have this red key line. And what I can do is I can click outside the clickable areas and just hit Command C, Command V to copy it. and then I can actually switch that into a row. And so now what I have is like I have a nice guideline that I can use when I'm aligning things within the component. And because the way frames work, you can also create like um, grids within your frame. So if we look at, this frame that Josh created, it's got these like 70 pixel images in it. If I was to click that top level frame, like we could create a layout grid that's a column grid. Maybe it's left aligned, and the gutter is, or the column width is 70, and I don't know what spacing you put in between those 4 pixels. We could do something like that, and it would just sort of keep going. So there's a few different ways that you can use grids to create like visual guidelines to sort of maintain spacing, and also use them in conjunction with constraints. And again, if you hit Command G, you can toggle those at any time. Yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing that I would highlight, just as you've sort of seen us working in Figma, is this idea of the code tab. So one thing to understand if you're new to Figma is that you can share Figma with as many different people as you want as viewers. There's no additional cost to them as users. So if you have like a large company and you want to bring in a whole bunch of different developers to collaborate with you via comments and also inspect your designs, it's just a matter of clicking on the share, typing in their email, or adding them if they're already on your team, giving them view access. And then when they log in, it'll actually default to this code palette that looks like this. And so when they click on things, they'll be able to get red lines and see distances between objects. And they'll be able to see like the font properties, either in like a CSS, iOS, Android view, or they can also go to like a more tabular view like that. So with that ability, you can, as a viewer, you can get those specs. You can export assets as PNG, PDF, SVG. You can also leave comments. So there's lots of different ways that you can bring more people into your design process and make it more collaborative. Anything to add, Josh?
No, yeah, actually, I'm gonna jump to my screen here. Let's bring up Safari. So going off of that, so, Tom touched briefly on the getting help. So we also have a great YouTube channel. So we have a ton of YouTube videos. It's just youtube.com/Figma design. We have a whole getting started playlist and the basics. So if you are new, I highly recommend watching these. They were created a little while ago, so some things may be slightly out of date or look a little bit different, but you should still get the core concepts from that. If you're looking for maybe some files to get started with, we have the resource hub, so figma.com/resources. And we have assets, courses, guides, and best practices. So Tom and I are actually writing, or we're starting to write a lot more articles or guides. So Tom has one on components and styles. I wrote one around images. And then we also feature community resources. So a user here, Alyssa, she created a Figma to Google Slides converter built on our API. We've got some wireframing kits, different mock-ups, things like that. So definitely give this a look. I think one of the best ways to learn, or at least for me, is by actually deconstructing previously created files from other users and trying to see what that looks like and how they created this, or, oh, they're using a drop shadow on that, or, inner shadow, things like that. I found it a great way to improve kind of my design workflow. And then we also have a blog where we share a lot of these guides as well, and other case studies and things like that, so you can get a feel for how other companies are using Figma, maybe how to adopt it to your own company. So those are resources. You can also find Tom and I, I'll go to the little hosted by screen here, on Twitter. So Tom's at _CA, and then I'm at neversitdull. We're pretty responsive on Twitter, so feel free to ask us questions there. Join our Spectrum community, follow Figma on Twitter, and yeah, we'll hopefully answer your questions. So we plan on doing these live streams weekly moving forward on different topics to from, I think our next one might be on prototyping. We'll do more of these Figma 101s. We might even do some more advanced ones where we bring in some guests and do some AMAs, things like that. So yeah, so thank you so much. Tom, did you have anything else you wanted to add before we close up?
No, I was just gonna say, like, let us know on Twitter. Feel free to DM or just tag us in on one of the Figma posts about the live streams to let us know the types of things that you'd love to see in these live streams. Like, if you have any ideas or things that you think would be really valuable to you, please tell us, and we'll do our best to try to address those in upcoming episodes.
Yeah, so thank you so much. You will be able to rewatch this. So if you're watching on YouTube, it's that same link. Once the live stream's done, it will still be publicly available. If you're watching on Twitch, same thing, just stay on our channel and we'll make sure that video is available. So yeah, hopefully this has been helpful. We'll try to do more of these in the future to expand maybe on some deeper dives into other topics. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take care.